Hello everybody and welcome to today's webinar in which we're going to be discussing the top 5 mistakes that smart people make. 5 ways that smart people do dumb things to sabotage their property investment success. And our special guest today is Miriam Sandkuhler from Property Mavens, one of Australia's leading buyer's agents and the author of this book. And if you haven't read it, you should. It's one of the best books on property investment that I've read in my 30-plus year career as a real estate investor, writer and researcher. Miriam's going to be taking us through some of the errors that people make in trying to grow their wealth through property investment. So welcome, Miriam, and tell me, how come smart people do dumb things as property investors?
Hi, Terry. Thank you for having me. Look, it's interesting. I find usually the higher or more educated the client that I deal with, or the client that I potentially come across as a client, the more they think that real estate is easy and that their intellect is superior usually to the real estate agent that they're dealing with, and that they'll be able to make smart decisions or not get caught up in being manipulated or misled, because they automatically assume that their intellect and skills in their profession will transfer across to a real estate negotiation.
So it sounds like ego gets in the way of common sense very often.
Yeah, pretty well. And usually the smarter, the more it gets in the way of common sense, simply for that reason.
Okay. So, Miriam, over to you to your presentation. I'm really looking forward to this one because I've seen, I know that you're a particularly well-researched practitioner and that you've done a lot of work in putting this presentation together based on your experience as a buyer's agent and as a researcher and as a property investor who's been very successful in your own right.
Thank you, Terry. Okay, so as you said, we're going to talk about the top 5 mistakes smart people make, and these are mistakes that I come across fairly frequently, and this is, a lot of it's to do with people's rationale and thinking. So we're dealing with psychological considerations here. Obviously, there's just a bit of a disclaimer on the screen stating that we're not providing tailored financial, tax, legal advice in any way whatsoever, or property advice, and we strongly recommend that people seek their own individual, independent accounting, legal, finance and property advice from an expert before embarking on actioning any information disclosed in the presentation. So what we're going to address today are, as I said, initially just the most common mistakes, over-analysis, how people can get stuck in over-analysis and the consequences of that, managing expectations, understanding supply and demand, and then property pricing, which is fairly complex in its own right. Okay, so just briefly, who are we? Well, Property Mavens, we're a specialist property advisory firm, and our expertise lies in finding what I call high-performing investment-grade property for clients, and we help people find the right property for their budget, whether they're owner-occupiers or investors. A little bit about me and my background. I'm a licensed estate agent. I choose to work as a buyer's advocate, so I legally represent and work for the interests of the buyer in any transaction. I'm an accredited property investment advisor, which is a little bit like a financial planner, but for direct property only. And as you mentioned before, very kindly, I'm a best-selling author of my book, Property Prosperity, and I do a lot of media commentary as well. And we've been finalists for a number of awards in the buyer advocacy area. So I've touched on this in the past, and there are other webinars that your members can actually go and look at. And in the past, we've talked about the 7 common mistakes property investors make, but still absolutely at a minimum. Mistake number 1, people don't understand their risk profile and they don't invest to their risk profile and the matching strategy, for want of a better word. So I would encourage everyone to go back to that original webinar and have a look at that in detail. Number 2, they don't have a clear plan of what they're trying to achieve, and that takes into consideration, time frames, budget. Age is really important, where they're at in their life. Are they 25 and about to have family and those commitments, or are they 50, 55 and looking towards retiring and generating income? So that's something to really take into account, and also engaging the right experts at the right time to help mitigate risk and maximise returns. So think of property investing as a business. You want to get the right advice in any business to make sure it's a success, and property investing is no different. So I'd encourage everyone at a minimum just to go back and have a look at those webinars, and there's lots of detail on those, but those 3 points specifically can make a massive difference. So this is what I come across a lot, over-analysis, and if there's a common phrase out there that over-analysis leads to analysis paralysis, And there has to come a point in time where investors draw a line in the sand and make a decision. You know, and a lot of the questions I get are, when is the best time to invest? Well, you know, quite frankly, one of the best times to invest is when the bank's going to give you the money, because if you don't have a bank who's prepared to lend you money for whatever reason, you're just simply not going to get in the market. So rather than chasing a cycle, or where is everything at in terms of the property cycle, and that's the best time to jump in, you may find, for whatever reason, lending policy changes constantly. It might be the right time in the cycle, but the banks may decide they don't want to give you the money. So first and foremost, I always start from the position of, can you get money? And if so, that's the time to buy. And then obviously you have to take other factors into consideration. So the reality is the market changes constantly depending on various factors, including economics, you know, how the economics within the particular state or city are performing. Interest rates, that's a factor. Supply and demand, that's a factor. So it's about taking that into consideration, but still taking action. The market isn't perfect, you know. I say to most people, you're never going to find the perfect property. If you want something that 100% ticks your boxes as an investor, well, then you buy a block of land and you build. But that's more a strategy for an owner-occupier. So when I'm working with clients, providing you understand the criteria that you need to look at, if it ticks around 80% of the boxes, well, then that should be good enough to be able to buy a property, providing it's the right boxes that are being ticked. So don't go looking for something that's going to tick 100% of everything, because you'll just simply never buy. You know, and we're not comparing apples with apples when you're looking at a property. You know, you might be looking at an apple, an orange, a banana. They're all different. Some will have pros, some will have cons. But again, ultimately, you've got to decide where that line in the sand is and then make a decision to take action. And if you're getting stuck, obviously there's an opportunity to go and seek professional advice to get some guidance there. And the reality is, what's time out of the market costing you? I've got a little case study that we're going to have a look at shortly, just to give you an example. But the other thing too is, an analysis is meaningless if you don't actually take action, because it's action that creates wealth, it's action that gets you in the market, and it's action that gets you earning income and or capital growth. So some examples of this, these are examples of properties I bought recently for clients. Now, this first one happened to be a development site. I bought it in August 2016 for a client for $705,000. And as at September this year, it was valued at $1 million based on the most recent sales. Now, if that client at the time had decided to wait for whatever reason, and in the space of, 13 months, that client would have almost been down, 45% in capital growth. So that's the cost. That would have been the cost of that client being out of the market in that suburb for that time. If we have a look at the second case study here, I just bought this in August for another client for $680,000. Now, last weekend, I missed out on a comparable property, only a matter of streets away, same size land, similar property type, and that sold at auction for $782,000. So in the space of 2 months, that is the most comparable recent sale. And that's a consequence of supply and demand. And that's a radical change in that short time. But that's, again, typical. If someone had even waited that period of time before they made a decision, that's potentially the cost. Another example here, this little villa unit I bought for a client in April of 2017 for $510,000. Bought that one off market. And, here we are only a matter of months, 7 months later, and the most recent comparable is at $610,000. So the cost of deciding, talking to 20 different people, getting 20 different opinions, do I buy in Sydney, do I buy in Brisbane, do I buy in Melbourne? And you're busy running around, asking everyone what their thoughts are, but not drawing the line in the sand. That is the consequence if you're buying investment grade property, or examples of what's certainly happening in the market in Melbourne in terms of what I'm buying and the clients that I'm working with. What are your thoughts on that, Terry?
Well, yeah, I'm very familiar with the terminology analysis, paralysis by analysis, and I come across it constantly with customers who clearly want to do something but just find it very, very hard to make a decision. I think it's because the sums of money involved for many people are quite daunting, and they're afraid of making a mistake. I think it's that primarily that the thing that stops people taking action when they can or should. And it's fear of getting it wrong. That's the problem.
Yeah.
A lot of people just can't overcome it.
Yeah, and look, that fear is something, and you may recollect I've written a chapter in my book about that very early on, about managing your money mindset. And if there is fear around anything, there are steps that you can put in place to help address those fears, to give you confidence and certainty to move forward. And again, depending, if it's fear of finance and fear of debt, it may be that you fix part of your loan and have the other part variable if you're concerned about cash flow. If it's fear of making a poor investment decision, well, that's where you might engage a buyer's advocate to give you guidance and support around doing that. If it's fear of not knowing what it's going to cost you to maintain a property, or if there are problems with it, that's where you do a building and pest inspection before you buy it. So depending on the fear and concern, that will dictate the action you need to take to be able to get past that. Yeah. But there's, and I would certainly understand that your members and your clients absolutely are coming to you for research and data so they can form an opinion. But again, the next step is to take the action and understand that if they don't, well, they're missing out on capital growth. And I say to clients, so for example, this client at the top here, and all of them, they've all paid me thousands of dollars to work for them and to go out there and do all the work and do all the research and find the properties and assess and negotiate. But they're all literally hundreds of thousands of dollars better off as a result. So for people to think, I'll do it myself, I'll save the money. Well, if you're in the market for 6 months missing out, you haven't actually saved money. It still cost you. It's just an invisible cost in that the prices have escalated and you've not put two and two together. So people will pay time out of the market, particularly if it's in a strong market and they're looking to areas where there's high demand and low supply. They will pay a price to not buy. They're just frequently not aware of it.
Yeah, I think one of the best ways that people can overcome that fear of taking action, and you touched on this early in your presentation, that is having a team around them, a team of people that they trust in various areas of expertise, a really good buyer's agent, a good source of information, a good mortgage broker, a good accountant who understands real estate, being willing to actually pay for experts in particular areas. And so you have a team that you can rely on and trust. It's a very good way of overcoming that paralysis by analysis problem that prevents a lot of people from taking action from which they would profit.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And again, it's about maximising return and mitigating risk. And there's a reason people are experts in their field, and there's a reason that you pay them. And the reality is it's very easy to make mistakes when it comes to property investing, because it's never what you know, it's always what you don't know. And that's where people come unstuck. And I've seen people do it time and time again when I look at their property portfolios and they ask me to assess them, and then I can do a report around it and just highlight 4 distinct areas that are affecting that property's ability to grow in value or not, and to give them evidence in which to make a decision around whether to keep it or not, because an underperforming or poor performing property in a portfolio isn't a good thing to have. And if people are holding on in the hope that it'll go up but it won't, and all they're doing is tying up borrowing capacity that could be better invested elsewhere, that's important information to find out. So there is a reason to engage experts, because every time someone thinks they're saving money, well, quite often it's costing them more, but they just don't realise it. And often it's after they've made the buying decision, the purchase, and then it's too late. They've invested hundreds of thousands. A lot of people don't want to take a hit knowing or accepting they've made a mistake, because there's a bit of shame around that. I mean, I'm very pragmatic. I've made mistakes in the past. Some of that content is in the book. That's why I've written the book, to help others. But I'm pragmatic. If I've made a bad decision, I'll deal with it and move on, and then make a smarter decision next time to cover any lost opportunity or whatever the case may be. And I've certainly done that in the past, which has obviously led me to working in the profession that I'm in and doing what I'm doing and having written a book. So it really is about taking the emotion out of it, or dealing with the emotion that's getting in the way of stopping you getting an outcome, and making a smart, evidence-based, unemotional decision.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving on, managing expectations, which is a little bit about what I was just talking about. People look at property with filters. They have their own personal filters. So I can be in a room, put a slide up of 2 different properties and ask everyone which one they would buy and why they would buy it. It's always fascinating to hear people's justification. or their reasoning, and it's through nothing other than filters, because I've given them no information other than a picture, and then their personal filters and experiences come into play. So it's really important to understand as an individual, to be conscious of that. You know, do I have expectations, or do I have an illusion or a belief system around what it needs to be for me to buy? And if that's an expectation or a filter that's potentially getting in your way, well, then you need to deal with it. So when I work with clients, I'm sometimes challenging their thinking, because certainly some of it will be valid, but if there's anything that gets in their way that stops them getting an outcome, well, then we usually have a conversation around that, because that's pretty well a lot of what I do personally, help clients get an outcome to help them get out of their own way, if that makes sense. Then the other thing is the property expectation. I mentioned it before. You're never in a second-hand market where we're dealing with established property. And again, there'll be a webinar that Terry and I have done around buying for land value and what makes an investment-grade property. So have a look at that. But if we're buying established property, you need to understand that with second-hand property, property that's 20, 30 years old, 50 years old, whatever the case may be, it's not going to necessarily have 100% of what you want, but that doesn't mean you throw it out and don't consider it. So come back to that 80% rule, providing you're looking for an investment and it doesn't need to meet emotional or personal needs like a home buyer. If it ticks 80% of the right criteria in the right boxes, well, then look at it seriously with the view to buying it. You still do your due diligence, you still do your contract reviews and your building and pest inspections, but that's the line in the sand to take action. Otherwise, all you'll do is keep looking and thinking the grass is greener, and that's where people get stuck. Then again, we've got market expectations. I come across this frequently. What someone wants to pay for a property, what the market price for the property is, and what you need to pay under competition are often three different things. So again, do adequate research to understand it's never about what you want to pay. If it's the right property in the right location, it's an A grade and it's going to attract a lot of competition, but that is what will engender capital growth for you down the track. Well, then be realistic around where the market's at for that and where you need to be to buy it. Otherwise, you'll just simply keep missing out and you won't buy. And so that's around price expectation too, in particular. Just be conscious of that, because, there's no second place at an auction if you miss out. It's only the person that understands where they need to be to buy it that will win or purchase that property. And then you have to start from scratch and start the whole journey again. And if it took you 4 months to find this one and it's cost you in the market, you can get help from a buyer's advocate just to assess and negotiate a property for you. You don't have to get them to find it. You can do that. But they can at least come in at the end and tell you in reality what you need to spend. Otherwise, you may just simply miss out and have to start that merry-go-round again. Okay, so moving on. The next thing to really understand that's important are supply and demand factors. So I talk about the micro and macroeconomics of real estate, and it's about having a tightly defined location that you're considering, not just a suburb that you like or that's got leafy streets that's really pretty. There've got to be more fundamentals around it. So if we talk macroeconomic factors, you want to be looking in an area where there's strong population growth, there's adequate property supply, there's good employment opportunities, and there's infrastructure development or established infrastructure there. So that's sort of your basic area search, for want of a better word. And then when you start narrowing it down to suburbs, you want to start looking at local amenities. So that'll be schools, shops, hospitals, council facilities, that sort of thing, cafe strips, shopping strips. You want to look at the buyer demand and the types of demand there, and the tenant demand as well. So people understand supply, but they don't, people understand demand, but they don't necessarily understand supply or oversupply and the implications around that. So it's really important to consider. So for example, if we look at this little image on the left, we're talking about house and land packages. Frequently, they're going to be in outer areas. There's going to be the opportunity to buy a brand new home in the state. But if there's substantial amounts of land there that can continue to be released and developed and released and developed, well, then there should be a realistic expectation that your opportunity for capital growth will be hindered by that, because where you've got ongoing supply of real estate and that's meeting demand, well, then that's never going to drive capital growth. Conversely, if we're looking at, say, the image on the right and we're more in a inner city location and there's no more land available to be developed and what's there is there and people want to live in that location and have that proximity, well, then this is a scenario usually that's reversed. Demand is frequently high and supply is frequently low. So again, it's being aware of those considerations before actually taking the step to purchase. So I've got a little case study here. I'll talk about what's going on, and I'm sure, Terry, you've done a hotspotting report on this particular area. So this is the Hume City Council in Victoria, and it encompasses quite a large area, including suburbs such as Broadmeadows, which is in that particular pocket too. Now, the Hume City population forecast for 2017 is 215,273 people, and it's forecast to grow to 372,627 by 2041. So that's substantial growth in that time, and there's already been substantial growth in the suburb, and primarily it's because there are a lot of affordable house and land packages. So this is very much an area that I'm talking about where there's a lot of supply, but also a lot of demand, and that demand is being met, and consequently the capital growth in Sunbury over the last 12 months was 12.66%, which was great, and the capital growth in Craigieburn within that particular council area was 10.73%. So that's great, and a lot of it's been driven by very high population growth. So when I spoke to my contacts at the council, we were having a conversation around what's driving this and also who's moving in there and what are the implications and the consequences. So in this particular situation, the council, when they did their planning, and they do it obviously over a course of a number of years, they kind of worked on the assumption that the average person who was residing in the area at the time had a typical family, 2 adults and 2.4 children, and that's what their forecasting and their budgeting and their planning encompassed. Now, we've had a lot of migration into Melbourne in particular. We are averaging about 100,000 people a year, more than any city in Australia, and that's driving demand as well, and that's also driving and inflating prices in certain areas. So the advantage here is that, or the opportunity has been that people have been coming in and buying affordable house and land packages, and that's contributed to price growth. But it's also provided some challenges for the council too, because a lot of those migrants that are coming in, whether they're Sudanese or Iranian or Indian, they're often coming in with large families. So they may have 3 or 4 or 5 children. And the council, to a degree, has actually been caught a little bit short because they haven't planned based on those numbers and families of that size. So I know the primary school, I think, had approximately 350 students this year, and next year they've got registrations for approximately 550. So that means they've had to dump 16 portables onto the primary school site because they've just had this massive influx of population growth that they're not able to accommodate, and that's the solution that they've had to do in the very short term to manage and deal with that. So you can understand where staff at the council, are obviously trying to cope with what's going on that was really quite unexpected. Another example of the implications is that public transport isn't able to meet that population growth. The planning that was in place can't rapidly change to accommodate that massive growth. So there are issues around that. And particularly in the area of Broadmeadows, I know that it consequently has probably the highest percentage of unemployment of Centrelink in Victoria. I think it's running at around 22%. And so you've got all these people coming into this area, and lack of public transport and lack of job and employment opportunities is what's contributing to unemployment. So on the one hand, it's good to have the reporting and the knowledge and the understanding of growth in the area, but you've got to look at those other growth drivers to see and understand from a medium to long-term point of view if it's going to be a good place to invest. So a lot to take into consideration. It's not just the research report. It's digging deeper and finding out more. Now, one thing I will say is this might be a glitch that's a 5 or a 10-year problem, and then once the issues of public transport are dealt with and once more employment opportunities present themselves, well, then things could substantially change. But as an investor, you want to ask yourself, is it worth taking the risk of buying there with the issues that are currently being presenting themselves, in the hope that in 10 years it's resolved and then I'll keep making more money then. So just, yeah, a lot to take into consideration when it comes to that kind of thing. There you go, Terry. That was a lot of talking without a break.
Yes, and well done. You obviously know the subject and you've obviously researched this particular area very well. Yeah, we're very mindful of the Hume City local government area. It's definitely on our radar screen. It's in our reports. It's got strong growth factors. It's benefits from housing affordability issues, also proximity to major jobs nodes. There's some very, very big jobs nodes up in that northern part of the Melbourne metropolitan area, and people like to buy firstly where they can afford, but ideally buying something affordable close to where they're working, keeping in mind that most people don't actually work in the CBD, which is one of the fallacies.
That's right. Yeah.
Around real estate investment. You've got to be close to the CBD because everyone works there. Well, the majority of people in Melbourne and any other city actually don't work in the CBD, and that northern part of Melbourne does benefit from having those massive job nodes like the fruit and vegetable markets moved up there. Massive logistics firms lining the ring road, big employers, major regional shopping centres, etc. So there are, it does tick plenty of boxes, but as you say, there are problems that people need to consider, including the high unemployment rate and the ability of public transport to keep up with demand.
Yeah, and look, there's obviously been really good capital growth, but whether that's sustainable based on those problems that we're talking about is the issue. And as you've said, there's ticks a lot of boxes, but it's just about, you know, digging a little bit deeper and then making a decision and being a little bit more informed. Not overanalyzing it so you do nothing, but you either make a decision to proceed or a decision to go elsewhere, but nevertheless it's a decision to keep moving forward and taking some sort of action.
Right.
Okay, and then pricing. So one thing I will say is pricing is really complex, and I spoke before about, you know, when you look at property, unless you're looking at an apartment building and they're all the same, and, you know, for land value, we don't necessarily suggest that that's a good thing to do. But, you know, we're looking at an apple, an orange, a banana, and it's really hard for the average person to understand how to appraise and price property. And like I said before, you know, there's what people want to pay, there's what the market indicates it's worth, but then under competitive circumstances at auction, well, where do you need to go and where is there a reasonable price to go to within reason without overpaying? Because then there could be implications and consequences with your lender if they don't agree with the price that you paid. So very few properties are the same. Variations to consider and include are things like the title type. You know, is it what we call a green title in Victoria? Is it strata? Is it stratum? Because depending on the title, that will influence or dictate a lender's willingness to lend or the percentage that they're going to lend on it. So be careful, you know, if someone's buying and they suddenly buy a stratum property at auction and they assume it's okay because their lender's given them approval, if they haven't checked with their lender on that first, they might find that they're getting less money lent to them or they're having to tip in more of equity than what they originally thought about. Zoning type, that'll obviously influence a property's value. So whether they're in a purely residential zone, whether the property itself is mixed use or commercial. The land size comes into play, the land shape, and more importantly, the land value. So if I talk about shape, you know, is it a regular block? Is it a standard rectangular block? Can someone do something more with it? Is it a property that potentially has the ability to be renovated and extended, or is it a site that can be subdivided and you know, further developed? So all of those things, and then who's buying that property? Who's your competition on the day? All of that stuff has to be taken into consideration to form an overall picture of where you need to be able to purchase it. And then we've got the property type as well. You know, what is it made of? What's the style? How big is it? What are the construction materials? Is it a period home? Is it a modern home? You know, I'm looking at a situation for a client at the moment where we've come across a potential development site, but in reality, the home is too new and too modern to warrant paying the price that the vendor wants. because we really want as high a land value as possible. And this particular property doesn't ultimately represent good value compared to another property that's a little bit smaller but substantially less for the reasons I've just described. So look, it is complex. You have to be aware, certainly in Victoria, underquoting still exists. Unfortunately, we have a legal framework now that enables agents to do it, and they're getting away with it simply because Consumer Affairs still doesn't have the manpower to police it. So depending on the state that you're buying in, be careful of things like that. Be careful of comparable sales that agents are using, because they may in fact not be comparable at all, and I frequently find that sometimes they're not. And then again, be careful of overpaying. Just because you've got the money to spend doesn't mean the property's worth that, and the bank may not agree with you, and that's a trick as well. So who can help you? Well, a licensed and sworn valuer can. You'll probably pay them $700 to come out and put a price on the property, and that will be based on most recent sales evidence. Now, that doesn't necessarily take into account what you need to pay for it on the day. So to give you a minimum benchmark of where you probably need to be or what it's worth, but then you've got to make informed decisions around where you're prepared to stretch to, if at all, to purchase it. And so that's something to take into account. A licensed buyer agent, and I mean licensed as in they've got their real estate agent's license and they're actually legally qualified to give you advice around this, because there are a lot of buyer agents out there calling themselves that but not qualified or not licensed, or they're selling agents pretending to be buyer agents. So a licensed buyer's advocate can help you with pricing as well. A lot of them offer and assess and negotiate service for you too. So again, there's a tendency where smart people, in my experience, tend to think that it's not too hard to figure out and that they're not going to necessarily get caught out by an agent, because their intellect is such that, they're smarter than the agent, so they're not going to come unstuck. But it's not about being smart when you're dealing in real estate. It's about understanding all the considerations and what you need to do to actually ultimately secure an outcome for yourself and a satisfactory one.
And Miriam, I just think that the slide that's currently on the screen and what you've just said about it is a wonderful case for the importance of having experts on your team and be willing to pay qualified people that you trust to help you, because determining value, considering all those aspects, title, zoning, land size, etc., I think it's beyond the average person. If for no other reason, they just don't have the time with their busy lives to put into actually researching all of that and coming up with a logical answer. And the smart way to proceed is to engage a buyer's agent such as yourself, or pay a valuer to give the answer. Willing to pay for professional advice and have people like that on your team.
And certainly, we have a sworn valuer on call who, if I ever come across a property and there's a bit of an anomaly or something, we'll have a chat around it and we'll talk about the implications of it. So, in our office here, we're continually educating ourselves around certain things. What are the implications of buying near an electricity tower, and how far away do we need to be from that for it not to affect the value of the property? So, creeks and all sorts of things that come into play, or being too close to a commercial zone, things like that. So we're forever having to look at each property on a case-by-case basis, understand things that affect it, even proximity to housing commission or social housing property we need to take into consideration, because that will have implications around the value as well. So, we are experts, but we still also seek expert help where we need it or feel we need a little bit of support. So don't feel that it's a bad thing to do it. And look, I've had a situation with one client where we were purchasing a property for them, and together we agreed that this was such a unique property it was appropriate to get a sworn valuer or a licensed valuer in. And we were able to save him $200,000 on the purchase, because the vendor's expectation and what the property were worth were totally different. And consequently, in that little exercise alone, because the price was so overquoted, we were able to get him a $200,000 saving as a result.
Yeah. It reminds me of when I purchased my home that I currently live in, I achieved a 20% reduction based on the asking price by getting not one but two valuations from two different valuers, providing the evidence that I thought existed that they were asking too much. And with the evidence of not one but two valuations, the vendor was able to see sense and bring down their price. Substantial saving, but a lot of people who hadn't been willing to go to those lengths to establish the true value of the property may have ended up paying too much.
Absolutely. And that's a really good strategy. And I suppose the other thing too, it's also understanding that sometimes even license values, there can be up to a 5% variation, because it's very hard to put an exact price on, and a value will usually have a range. And I've seen valuations come in on the same property with a 5% leeway, and that's deemed acceptable. But, you know, on a $950,000 property, that still might be a $45,000 difference. So, you know, at least in doing that, obviously you've got a really good outcome, and that works really well if you've got property up for private sale. You know, auctions are totally different kettle of fish and much more complex, because you've got that whole emotional factor and time under pressure, and people do silly things at auctions as a result, including the result I saw last weekend where, you know, quite frankly, the couple that bought it totally overpaid for it, and I think easily they were $50,000 over where that sat at the top range of where I'd appraised it. But anyway, that's their issue, their choice. So, yeah, rest assured this is one of the most complex parts of buying property. And you want to make sure you're getting the right advice and understand what you're buying so as to not miss out, particularly if you've spent days and weeks and months tracking this particular property down with a view to buying it.
Yep.
You know, this is the last place where you want to sort of get to the point where you make a big mistake and you miss out, because it just starts the whole process all over again.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's it really, Terry. I mean, they're the things where smart people get in their own way. Because intellect and skill set in their own profession doesn't necessarily translate to buying real estate. So I know we don't have any questions now, but certainly I did want to put an offer forward for any attendees that are viewing the webinar. If you really want to check out how smart you are and how much of a guru you are when it comes to property investing, we have a little quiz that you can take. It's a free quiz. It'll take you just a matter of minutes. If you go onto my website, propertymavens.com.au, click on resources and then click on rate your property expertise. Go through, pop in your details, start the quiz, and that'll break down 7 sectors where you can get an assessment around where your knowledge gaps are. So it'll highlight to you where you're really knowledgeable. It'll highlight where you probably need to improve your knowledge and maybe get some assistance as well. So, you know, feel free to do that too. And then again, the usual opportunity, this is what we do. We buy investment grade property for clients. If anyone would like to contact us for help, feel free to get in touch, and we're happy to offer a free consultation for all of the Hotspotting members.
Okay, Miriam, well, I've got a few questions for you on behalf of our listeners. If I could toss a few of them at you.
Okay, go for it.
One of the phrases you used in your presentation that I rather liked, but I wondered if you could expand on a little bit. It's that you said it's not what you know, it's what you don't know. And I wondered if you could toss in an example or two of perhaps case studies of people who have come across through what they didn't know.
Yeah, so I had some clients that came in once, and they'd actually bought and developed or built a house and land package in an area where, you know, they'd done the research, it was growing and so forth, and they'd literally carefully ticked every single box. But the reason they were having problems with the property is that they didn't take into account that the amount of rent they were asking to lease the property was about the same amount of money as what someone would be paying on a mortgage. So because they were in an affordable area and because of interest rates at the time, anyone with a deposit and the capacity to buy and build their own home was consequently doing that. And they were finding that they couldn't lease their property because everyone in the area were home buyers that had the ability to buy and build their own home for the same amount of money as the rent. So that's one clear example that comes to mind. And in the end, they had to sell the property because they just simply could not rent it. And it ultimately didn't end up being an asset that was generating any income for them. And they didn't make a lot of capital growth in the process, but they understood that they didn't give consideration to who their tenant would be and who it needed to be to help them hold the property so that it would grow in value over time. So that's definitely where they came unstuck in the process.
Okay. You mentioned that a lot of people look at property through filters, their own set of filters. And in my mind, filters often means prejudices or biases that a lot of people think they know something about real estate. And I often think, particularly when I'm speaking to live audiences, based on the questions I'm getting, that people have their heads full of misinformation and they really they need to unlearn what they think they know and start again by going with experts to yourself. Do you find that in your work as a buyer's agent?
Oh, frequently. You know, one of the common filters is when I present a property to a client, they look at or assess it on the basis that they wouldn't live there. But, you know, that becomes totally irrelevant because we're not buying a home for them, we're buying an investment property. And it's important to understand that they may not be the demographic that we're looking for to rent the property from them. So whether or not they would live there is totally irrelevant. That's just simply one common, you know, thought process that I come across. What else? You know, don't like the style of it, don't like the colour of it. Gosh, I had one client once who I found an incredible investment grade property for, and she rejected it because she had one like that but in a totally different regional town. And so her rationale was she didn't want two properties that were similar even though they were in two totally different regional cities. And to be honest, that was quite ridiculous because in every sense of the word, it really was an investment grade property, which highlighted she'd done very well in the other place on her own. But it really wasn't, I suppose, a valid reason to walk away from what was an exceptional opportunity just because of the fact that, you know, she wanted a different type when it was an investment grade property and it did meet her brief. And notwithstanding, it was her prerogative to reject it. But it wasn't, I suppose, it wasn't a really logical or rational reason. And this is where people come unstuck. They make irrational decisions. They make emotional decisions. Their filters are frequently emotional. Yeah. And one of the things I suppose I'm pretty good at with clients is helping them take the emotion out of it to then make a fully informed evidence-based decision to move forward.
Okay. You mentioned that some people achieve paralysis by wanting to tick 100% of the boxes, and that quite often it's okay to proceed when it ticks 80%. In terms of the 20% that might be missing, what are some of the acceptable or minor things that people should just let go of if it's preventing them from proceeding and buying something that's worthwhile?
Okay, well, look, I think, it might be just, you wouldn't live there, you don't like the colour of it, the floor plan's on 100%. Mind you, having said that, it still needs to be a reasonable floor plan. It can't be so bad and so awkward that it just doesn't work. So there are variations, and I suppose when I look at a property, we're assessing 57 different criteria, and there might be elements that score very low, but other elements that score quite high, but collectively it's okay. So probably what I'd say, it's more about things that you would walk away from. So if you've got real issues with overlooking, if you've got real issues with potential problem neighbours, particularly if it's social housing or you're aware that that's in very close proximity, that's a good reason to walk away. Street appeal, if it's a really bad street appeal or really big problems with parking or things like that, sometimes they can be reasons to walk away. Even something as simple as security and safety. Are you in an environment where a tenant would feel safe living there? Would an owner-occupier feel safe living there? So if you're buying in areas that are still being gentrified, that's okay, but you still want to make sure that there's no immediate threat to a tenant or a future home buyer that's going to affect your ability to rent or resell the property. So it's more the bigger things to me that would make up the 20% that you'd walk away from a property from. And then, if those smaller things collectively add up to 80%, orientation, is the property facing south and it's totally, blocked in on all sides where you get no sunlight whatsoever, that's a good enough reason to walk away. And then the rest is simply that combination of everything else to at least, hit that 80% mark. And it depends on the strategy too, Terry. I mean, if someone's looking for a property that they're going to ultimately renovate, extend, do up, well then from a scoring point of view, that's going to be, not score as high necessarily because of the fact that work has to be done on it. Whereas if it's a property that's modern and relatively recently new and, might have 4 or 5 years on it, well, you want that to score relatively high because of obviously what it is, the condition that it's in and so forth. So everything's a variation, and this is why pricing is so complex, because so much has to be taken into account.
Okay. Yeah, you touched on zoning issues and just very briefly mentioned sometimes you can come across a property in a particular zoning with or particular land size where there may be an opportunity in the future to subdivide, do an extra dwelling on that property. I'm finding that investors around Australia are looking more and more for those additional twists, those value-adding opportunities, and less satisfied with pure passive investment where you buy something that you can put a tenant into and wait for it to grow in value. Are you finding that that's increasingly an important criteria for your customers and something that people should be keeping an eye out for?
Yeah, I mean, look, definitely there are people who want to go down that path, and I'll be very upfront by saying it matches their risk profile. So the thing about developing and adding value and doing all of that, it's not for the faint-hearted. The reason you make big returns is because there are big risks that come with it, and you can equally lose a lot of money. So if you don't know what you don't know and you're doing it for the first time, chances are you'll make mistakes because you simply don't know what you don't know, and you may overcapitalise, you may simply do the wrong thing. So when I'm looking for those sorts of properties and sites, I'm only working with investors who have a very high risk profile. They understand it's a high risk strategy. They've either got experience or knowledge or connections or someone who can project manage and do it for them, obviously for a fee, and that mitigates some of that risk. But I don't do it for everyone, and not everyone wants it because they want to be able to sleep at night. So yes, that's some of what I do for some of my clients, but that's probably a smaller percentage because of that high risk component. And one thing I'll say, if you're working as a couple, you want to invest to the person with the lowest risk profile. Otherwise, you'll fight about money. That person will be stressed and it's not good for the relationship.
Okay, Miriam, well, thank you. I think that probably brings us towards the end of our session. Thank you for your presentation. I must say that I always get a great feeling of comfort and assurance when I'm listening to you do a presentation, because clearly you are very, very good at what you do. You know your territory very well, and you also clearly do a lot of research as part of the process of acting as a buyer's agent for people, and your attention to detail is very great. So I'm sure that people listening today will have got that same feeling that they can trust what they're hearing, and that they should put into action the sorts of advices that you're giving them. I was impressed by the degree of attention you pay to a market like Hume, for example, which is one that a lot of investors and home buyers are paying a lot of attention to because of affordability, etc. But alerting people to some of the not so good things about a growth area like that they need to understand, not necessarily stopping from buying there, but just to be aware that there is a downside to all those wonderful growth numbers that they're reading. You also made me even more aware than I was before of the complexities that can be involved in choosing a good piece of real estate, and in particular the importance of having experts on your team. I think this is one of the biggest learnings for me, and I think for people listening, is that you really must build a team around you if you're going to be successful with property investment, and be willing to spend some money on that, because it's the worst kind of false economy in property investment to be not willing to spend that money, but rather in contrast be willing to go out and spend $500,000 or more on a piece of real estate, but not being willing to spend relatively small sums of money, making sure that the piece of real estate you buy is the right one for you. So thank you again, Miriam. It's always a wonderful presentation when I do a webinar with you, so thank you for that. I hope the people listening today got as much out of it as I personally did. And if people want to follow up, perhaps to ask you questions or perhaps make use of the services you provide, the slide on the screen, I think, provides the answer to the question I was about to ask you, how they get in touch with you.
Yeah, so if anyone wants a consultation, they just go on the website under contact. What I'll also say under that resources tab, there are free guides that people can download, 7 common mistakes investors make, home buyers make, self-managed super fund investors make. So definitely click on that just to download those. You don't have to share your details with me to benefit from reading that. If you wanted to buy my book, Property Prosperity, you can buy it there, and I've got sometimes run different offers through the course of the year, but that's quite cheap on Kindle as well. I think you can buy it for less than $10 on Kindle. Yeah, and then if someone wants an actual consultation, just fill in the form and send it through, and we'll certainly be in touch and endeavour to point people in the right direction. But coming back to what you said about experts, particularly if you're investing, first expert that you absolutely also have to talk to is your accountant, because everything else is irrelevant if you don't have the right tax structure from the beginning to suit your circumstances, because you'll literally give away, potentially half of any gains you make in tax. So I just want to highlight that's a really important one too. And under that resources tab here as well, there are a number of the webinars that we've already done together, Terry. So if people want to go and revisit those webinars, you can click on under that resource tab and have a look at those too.
Okay. Thank you again, Miriam. And just reminding people, this is the book we've been referring to. As I said, it's one of the very best books on property investment that I've read in the 30 to 35 years I've been doing what I do in residential real estate. So thank you again, Miriam. Thank you, people, for tuning in and listening. This is Terry Ryder from Hotspotting. Over and out for now.